The scream came from the north gate, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet night like a blade through silk. Elena's heart froze behind the crumbling stone wall, her heart slamming against her ribs. She pressed her back against the cold stone and clutched the small glass vial in her palm, the only thing standing between her and disaster. If the wind shifted even slightly, if a single drop of her real scent slipped past the herbs she had rubbed into her skin that morning, every wolf within a mile would know exactly what she was. She had trained herself for years to move like a shadow, to breathe shallow, to never let her guard fall even in sleep. Tonight, that training was being tested in the worst possible way. Patrol wolves from the Alpha King's territory had entered the outskirts of the rogue settlement without warning, and panic had already begun to spread through the narrow dirt streets. Elena peered around the wall. Torches bobbed in the darkness, carried by broad-shouldered men who moved with the kind of discipline only royal guards possessed. She recognized their crest immediately, a silver wolf head stitched into black cloth, the king's men. And where the king's men went, the king's law followed. If they searched the settlement house by house, there would be nowhere left to hide. Her adoptive pack leader, a stern but caring woman named Odette, grabbed her arm from behind. "They are not here for a raid," Odette whispered. "There's a summons. Every pack within the borders lands must attend the gathering by order of the crown. All of us, no exceptions." Elena's stomach dropped. A gathering meant close quarters. It meant nobles and alphas with senses sharp enough to detect a lie in the air before a single word was spoken. It meant the one place on earth she could never afford to be. "I can't go," she said, her voice barely audible. "You know what happens if he catches even a trace of what I really am." Odette's expression didn't soften, but there was sympathy buried beneath the sternness. "Refusal is treason, child. If we do not send our numbers, the king will assume rebellion, and rebellion invites slaughter. You have hidden for 6 years. You can hide for one more night." Elena's mind raced back to the day everything had changed. The day her birth pack had been destroyed by wolves, seeking to claim what she carried in her blood. She had been young then, barely old enough to understand the weight of the word Omega, barely old enough to grasp why so many alphas would tear a territory apart just to find a scent like hers. She only remembered running, the smoke, the silence that followed, and the years of disguise that came after. The herbal tonic she used was bitter and foul-smelling, made from crushed root and ash bark, strong enough to smother her natural scent beneath something plain and forgettable. It worked, most of the time. It had kept her alive this long. But a gathering hosted by the Alpha King himself was an entirely different threat. Cain Ashworth was not simply another ruler. He was said to have senses beyond any wolf alive, an inheritance from bloodlines that stretched back to the first packs. Rumors claimed he could detect deception in a heartbeat and identify a person's truest nature from a single breath of air. "There is no version of tonight where I do not go," Elena finally said, resigned. "But I will not go unprepared." She spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing a stronger batch of her tonic, boiling the roots twice, adding crushed lavender to mask the sharper edges of her real scent. She dressed in simple, unremarkable clothing, the kind that would not draw a second glance. She practiced keeping her eyes low, her voice steady, her breathing measured. Every movement had to look ordinary. Being noticed was the one thing she could not survive. By sunrise, the settlement had gathered at the edge of the forest path, preparing for the long walk toward the castle grounds where the gathering would be held. Elena walked among the others, careful to blend into the middle of the crowd, neither first nor last, simply present enough to be counted, invisible enough to be forgotten. The journey took most of the day. The forest gave way to open plains, and eventually the castle came into view. A massive structure of gray stone, with towers that seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. Banners bearing the silver wolf crest hung from every wall, snapping in the wind like warnings. Elena had heard stories about the castle her whole life, but seeing it now she understood why so many spoke of it with equal parts awe and fear. Guards lined the entrance, checking each arriving pack against lists held by scribes. Elena kept her head down as Odette spoke on behalf of their group, confirming names and numbers. When it came her turn, she gave only her first name, praying the scribe would not ask for more. He didn't. He simply nodded and waved her through. Inside, the castle halls were already filling with representatives from dozens of packs, all dressed in their finest, all carrying themselves with the practiced confidence of people who had nothing to hide. Elena felt distinctly out of place among them, a single thread of anxiety woven into a tapestry of composed faces. The main hall was enormous, with vaulted ceilings and long tables set for a formal gathering. At the far end sat a raised platform, empty for now, but clearly meant for the king himself. Elena's eyes lingered there for only a moment before she forced herself to look away. She could not afford to be caught staring at the throne, could not afford to draw attention in any way. She found a spot near the back of the hall, close to a stone pillar that offered at least the illusion of cover. Around her, other pack members spoke in hushed, excited tones about the reason for the summons. Some believed it was simply a renewal of territorial agreements. Others whispered about rumors of unrest among neighboring kingdoms, suggesting the king wanted to display a unified front of loyal packs before any conflict could take root. Elena barely listened. Her focus remained on controlling her breathing, on keeping her expression neutral, on making sure the tonic she had applied that morning held strong beneath the layers of nervous sweat gathering at the back of her neck. Nerves, she knew, could weaken the tonic's effect. Fear had a scent of its own, and beneath fear, sometimes, other truths could slip free. A horn sounded from the front of the hall, and the room fell silent almost instantly. Every head turned toward the raised platform, as a set of great doors opened behind it. Elena's pulse quickened, despite her best efforts to remain calm. The king entered. He moved with an unhurried authority that immediately commanded the room. Dark hair swept back, sharp eyes scanning the crowd with the precision of a predator assessing territory. He wore no crown, no elaborate ornamentation, only a fitted coat of deep charcoal that somehow made him more imposing than any amount of jewelry could have. Elena had expected arrogance, the kind of performative dominance she had seen in lesser alphas trying to prove their strength. Instead, what she saw was something quieter and far more dangerous: absolute certainty. He took his seat upon the platform, and immediately, the hall buzzed with a mixture of relief and anticipation, as if his very presence had answered a question none of them had dared to ask aloud. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the floor, counting the seconds, willing the gathering to move quickly so she could return to the safety of anonymity. She listened as advisors began reading formal announcements, renewals of borders, updates on trade agreements between packs, mundane details that under any other circumstance would have bored her to distraction. Tonight, she welcomed the boredom. Boring meant safe. Then, without warning, she felt it. A prickling sensation along the back of her neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. She resisted the urge to look up immediately, forcing herself to count to 5, before allowing her eyes to drift toward the platform. The king was looking directly at her, not scanning the crowd, not glancing in her general direction by accident. His gaze was fixed, unblinking, focused entirely on the small space where she stood near the stone pillar. Elena's stomach twisted into a knot so tight it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. She lowered her eyes again immediately, praying it had been a coincidence, praying he had simply been looking at something behind her, the pillar, the wall, anything but her. But some instinct, buried deep and impossible to ignore, told her otherwise. The formal announcements continued, droning on about supply routes and hunting boundaries, yet Elena could feel the weight of that gaze return again and again throughout the evening, brief but deliberate, as though the king were testing something, confirming a suspicion he had not yet spoken aloud. By the time the gathering was dismissed for the evening meal, Elena's nerves had stretched to their breaking point. She excused herself from Odette's side, claiming she needed air, and slipped out through a side corridor toward one of the castle's smaller courtyards. The cool evening breeze offered some relief, carrying away the suffocating warmth of the crowded hall. She pressed her palms against the stone railing and closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, the way she had practiced 1,000 times before. It was nothing, she told herself. He was simply observing the crowd, as any ruler would. There was no reason to believe he had noticed anything unusual about her. And yet, some quiet and persistent voice in the back of her mind refused to be comforted. Footsteps echoed behind her, unhurried, deliberate, the same measured confidence she had witnessed on the platform only an hour before. Elena's entire body went rigid. "You left rather quickly," a low voice said from somewhere behind her. "I hope the gathering wasn't too tedious." Elena turned slowly, already knowing who she would find standing in the courtyard entrance, moonlight casting sharp shadows across features that were, despite everything, undeniably striking. The Alpha King regarded her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between curiosity and quiet calculation. "Not tedious, my lord," she managed, keeping her voice steady, despite the roaring in her ears. "Simply warm inside. I needed air." "Understandable." He took a few steps closer, close enough that Elena had to fight every instinct urging her to step back. "Though I find it curious that among a hall full of familiar faces, yours is one I do not recognize. I am new to my pack, my lord. I do not travel often." "I see." His eyes lingered on her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself not to look away, understanding instinctively that averting her gaze too quickly would only draw more suspicion. "And what pack do you claim?" "Odette's settlement, near the eastern woods." He nodded slowly, as though filing the information away for later use. "A modest territory. Peaceful, from what I understand." He paused, tilting his head slightly, and Elena felt her chest tighten as his gaze seemed to sharpen. Focus. Search for something beneath the surface of her carefully maintained composure. "Tell me, do you find the herbs of the eastern woods particularly strong this season? I only ask because your scent carries quite an unusual note tonight." Elena's blood ran cold. She forced a small, polite smile, praying it looked more natural than it felt. "The season has been damp, my lord. Perhaps that affects the air." "Perhaps." He studied her for another long moment, and Elena had the distinct impression that he knew far more than his casual tone suggested, that this entire conversation was some kind of quiet test she did not fully understand the rules of. "Enjoy the evening air, then. I imagine the hall will grow warm again soon enough." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Elena alone in the courtyard, with her heart hammering so violently she feared he might still hear it from down the corridor. She gripped the stone railing until her knuckles turned pale, replaying every word of the exchange, searching for any clue as to what he truly suspected. He had noticed something. She was certain of that now. Whether it was enough to condemn her, she could not yet say. But one thing had become painfully clear in that brief and unsettling conversation. The Alpha King was not a man easily fooled, and Elena Hart had just become someone he intended to watch very closely. The bell for the evening meal rang across the courtyard, and Elena forced her trembling hands to steady before she returned to the great hall. She could not afford to look shaken, not now, not with those sharp eyes potentially still watching from some hidden vantage point. She smoothed the front of her simple dress, took a slow breath, and walked back inside, as though nothing at all had happened. Odette found her near the long tables where food was being served. Platters of roasted meat and fresh bread passed hand to hand among the gathered packs. "There you are," Odette said, relief evident in her voice. "I was beginning to worry. You disappeared rather suddenly." "I only needed air," Elena said, forcing a small smile. The hall grew warm. Odette studied her for a moment longer than necessary, the way a mother studies a child she suspects is hiding something. But she said nothing further, simply guiding Elena toward an open seat at one of the lower tables reserved for visiting settlements. Throughout the meal, Elena remained acutely aware of the platform at the front of the hall, though she refused to let her eyes drift toward it more than once. The king had returned to his seat, engaged in quiet conversation with several advisors, and a woman Elena did not recognize, tall and elegant, wearing a deep green gown that marked her as someone of considerable status. Elena wondered, briefly, whether the woman might be a betrothed or a close ally, but she pushed the thought aside quickly. It was not her concern. Nothing about the king was her concern. Not tonight. Not ever, if she could help it. Yet the unsettling truth remained lodged in her chest, like a splinter she could not remove. He had commented on her scent, not in an accusatory way, not with any outward suspicion that others might have noticed, but the comment had been deliberate, precise, aimed directly at the one vulnerability she had spent years trying to erase. She picked at her food without much appetite, her mind cycling through every possible explanation he might have settled on. Perhaps he assumed she carried some illness that altered her natural scent. Perhaps he believed she used unusual soaps or oils common to her region. Perhaps, and this was the possibility that frightened her most, he had already recognized exactly what she was, and simply chose not to announce it in front of a hall full of witnesses. That last thought kept her awake, long after the meal ended, and the gathered packs were shown to guest quarters within the castle's outer wings. She lay on the narrow cot provided to her, staring at the stone ceiling above, listening to the quiet breathing of the other women sharing the room. and replaying every second of the conversation in the courtyard. Morning came far too quickly. A servant knocked on the door before dawn, informing the guests that the formal proceedings would resume shortly after breakfast, and that attendance was mandatory for all representatives, regardless of rank or settlement size. Elena dressed carefully, applying a fresh layer of her tonic, doubling the usual amount despite the risk that too much might smell equally unnatural. It was a gamble either way. Too little, and her true scent might slip through. Too much, and the artificial mask itself might draw suspicion. She chose caution over comfort and hoped for the best. The great hall filled again with representatives from across the kingdom, and Elena took her place near the back once more, though this time she made a conscious effort to stand slightly farther from any obvious hiding spot. Appearing to hide, she reasoned, was almost as dangerous as being caught. Better to stand in plain sight and trust her disguise than to appear as though she had something to conceal. The king entered without fanfare this time, taking his seat as the hall fell silent in practiced unison. Elena kept her gaze low, focused on a spot somewhere near the base of the platform, careful not to meet his eyes even by accident. The proceedings began with reports from border settlements, discussions of recent skirmishes with rival territories to the north, and updates on trade routes disrupted by early-season storms. Elena found herself actually listening this time, grateful for anything that might distract her racing thoughts. She learned that tensions had been rising along the northern border for months, with a rival alpha named Callister Vane reportedly amassing loyal wolves under the pretense of self-defense, though many within the king's court suspected more ambitious motives. The northern territories have grown restless, one advisor stated, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. Vane's numbers grow each season, and his rhetoric grows bolder. We must consider the possibility that this gathering alone will not be enough to discourage further provocation. The king's expression remained unreadable throughout the report, his fingers steepled thoughtfully before him. Vane has always sought power beyond his territory's borders, he finally said, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. We will not act rashly, but we will not appear weak either. Increase patrols along the contested regions. I want regular reports, not assumptions. The advisors nodded, scribbling notes, and the proceedings moved forward to less urgent matters. Elena allowed herself to relax slightly, grateful the focus had shifted away from anything resembling scrutiny of individual attendees. Perhaps, she thought, the king's attention the previous evening had simply been a passing curiosity, quickly forgotten amid the weightier concerns of his kingdom. That fragile relief shattered less than an hour later, when a guard approached her directly during a brief recess, requesting her presence in one of the smaller meeting chambers adjoining the main hall. Elena's stomach dropped instantly. "Is there a problem?" she asked, keeping her voice as level as possible. "No problem," the guard replied, though his tone offered little comfort. "The king wishes to discuss settlement matters with several representatives individually. It is simply procedure." Elena glanced toward Odette, who offered a reassuring nod. Clearly unaware of the depth of danger Elena believed the meeting represented. With no reasonable way to refuse without drawing suspicion, Elena followed the guard through a narrow corridor branching off from the main hall, her mind racing through every possible outcome, none of them favorable. The chamber she entered was smaller than the great hall, warmly lit by several tall windows overlooking the castle grounds. A modest table sat at its center, and the king stood near one of the windows, his back partially turned as she entered. The guard who had escorted her stepped back into the corridor, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Elena alone, with the one man in the kingdom capable of unraveling everything she had spent years building. "Thank you for coming," the king said, turning to face her fully. "I hope the summons did not alarm you unnecessarily." "Of course not, my lord," Elena replied, though her pulse betrayed the calm tone of her voice. "How may I be of service?" He gestured toward a chair near the table, and Elena took the seat carefully, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. The king remained standing, studying her with the same unsettling intensity she had noticed the previous evening. "I have been reviewing the settlement records for the Eastern Woods," he said after a moment. "Your pack leader, Odette, has served this kingdom loyally for many years. Her settlement has always paid its dues and honored its agreements without complication." "She is a fair leader," Elena said carefully. "The settlement is fortunate to have her guidance." "Indeed." He moved closer, though not so close as to feel threatening, simply close enough that Elena could not ignore the weight of his presence filling the room. Yet your name does not appear in any of the settlement's official records prior to 3 years ago. Odette's reports mention new arrivals occasionally, of course, refugees from smaller, unprotected territories seeking shelter under a stronger Pax protection. Is that your circumstance? Elena's mind raced, searching for the safest possible answer, one close enough to plausible truth to withstand scrutiny, without revealing anything dangerous. Yes, my lord. My previous settlement suffered hardship. Odette's pack offered refuge. What hardship, precisely? Illness, Elena lied, the words slipping out more smoothly than she expected. Many of our numbers did not survive. Those of us who did sought protection elsewhere. The king studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself to meet his gaze, understanding instinctively that looking away now would only confirm whatever suspicion already lingered behind his sharp eyes. Illness, he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of the word. A tragic circumstance, if true. It is true, my lord. I do not doubt your sincerity, he said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. I simply find it curious that illness alone would leave so few survivors, and fewer still, willing to speak of the settlement they once called home. Elena said nothing, understanding that any further explanation risked deepening the hole she had already dug for herself. The king seemed to sense her hesitation, and rather than pressing further, he allowed a moment of silence to stretch between them, heavy and deliberate. I will not press you further today, he finally said, moving back toward the window. Grief takes many forms, and I have no wish to reopen old wounds unnecessarily. However, I would ask that you remain within the castle grounds through the remainder of the gathering. There are matters of settlement security I intend to discuss more thoroughly before the proceedings conclude, and I would prefer all representatives remain accessible. Of course, my lord, Elena said, rising from her chair, relief and dread warring within her in equal measure. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her once more. One more thing, he said, and Elena froze, her hand resting against the chamber door. The tonic you wear. Lavender and ash root, if I am not mistaken, with something bitter beneath it I cannot quite place. An unusual combination for someone claiming no unusual circumstance. Elena's breath caught in her throat, every carefully constructed lie threatening to collapse in an instant. She turned slowly, forcing her expression to remain neutral despite the panic clawing at her chest. A remedy for headaches, my lord. The travel has not agreed with me. His eyes held hers for a long, unbearable moment, and Elena had the distinct and terrifying impression that he did not believe a single word she had spoken, yet chose, for reasons she could not begin to guess, not to press the matter further. Rest well then, he said finally. I imagine the remaining proceedings will prove far less taxing than headaches. Elena left the chamber on unsteady legs, her mind spinning with the certainty that whatever fragile disguise she had maintained for years was beginning, slowly and irreversibly, to unravel beneath the watchful gaze of a king who already seemed to know far more than he had any right to. Rain began to fall just as the midday proceedings resumed, drumming steadily against the tall windows of the great hall. Elena sat rigidly in her usual place near the back, her thoughts still tangled around the unsettling conversation from the chamber. She replayed his final words again and again, the casual mention of lavender and ash root, the bitter note beneath it he claimed he could not identify. He had identified it. She was certain of that now. He simply chose, for reasons unknown, not to say so aloud. The proceedings themselves moved slowly through matters of settlement taxation and shared hunting grounds, subjects that under normal circumstances would have held little interest for her. Today, they offered a welcome distraction, a chance to breathe, to think, to plan her next move without the immediate pressure of his eyes upon her. By mid-afternoon, the rain outside had intensified into a genuine storm, thunder rolling across the distant hills and rattling the ancient glass in its frames. A messenger entered the hall, whispering urgently to one of the king's advisors, who then leaned close to relay the message to the king himself. Elena watched from a distance as his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, from mild attentiveness to sharpened focus. It seems the northern bridge has flooded, the king announced to the assembled hall. Several settlements traveling from the outer territories will be delayed until the waters recede. We will adjourn the formal proceedings until tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I trust the castle can offer adequate shelter and comfort to our guests." A murmur of relief moved through the crowd, and representatives began filing out of the hall in small groups, seeking warmth and conversation in the castle's many common rooms. Elena rose along with the others, grateful for the reprieve, though her relief proved short-lived. As she made her way toward the guest quarters, a sudden gust of wind slammed one of the corridor's outer doors open, sending a spray of rain sweeping down the hallway. Elena, closer to the door than most, found herself caught directly in the sudden downpour, before a nearby guard managed to force the heavy door shut again. She stood soaked and shivering in the corridor, the cold rainwater running down her neck and shoulders, soaking through the fabric of her simple dress. Panic seized her almost instantly. Water, she knew from bitter experience, was one of the few things capable of washing away even the strongest tonic. She needed to reach her quarters immediately, needed dry clothing and a fresh application before anyone else drew too close. She hurried down the corridor, water dripping steadily from her hair, drawing more attention than she would have liked from passing servants and guests alike. She rounded a corner too quickly and collided directly with someone stepping out from an adjoining hallway, the impact nearly knocking her off balance entirely. Strong hands caught her shoulders, steadying her before she could stumble, and Elena looked up to find herself staring directly into the king's dark, assessing eyes. For one horrifying suspended moment, neither of them moved. Elena watched, frozen with dread, as something shifted behind his expression, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, his entire body going rigid in a way that had nothing to do with mere surprise at their collision. The rain had washed away her tonic entirely. There was no mistaking the change in his demeanor now. His grip on her shoulders tightened, not painfully, but with an intensity that betrayed the sudden loss of his usual composed restraint. His eyes darkened, pupils expanding, and for the briefest instant, Elena glimpsed something ancient and instinctive, flickering just beneath the surface of his controlled exterior. Something that looked remarkably like recognition, and beneath that, something far more dangerous. Desire, raw and immediate, quickly suppressed but not quite hidden fast enough. Elena's breath caught entirely, panic and confusion warring within her as she realized, with sickening clarity, that whatever remained of her disguise had just been completely stripped away, standing soaked and exposed in a castle corridor before the one man capable of destroying everything she had worked so desperately to protect. "My lord," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Forgive me, I did not see you. Are you injured?" His voice came out lower than before, rougher around the edges, though he seemed to be exerting considerable effort to keep his tone even and measured. "No, my lord, only startled." His hands remained on her shoulders a moment longer than necessary before he released her, stepping back with visible effort, putting deliberate distance between them, as though physical space alone might restore whatever control he was fighting to maintain. His eyes never left her face, though Elena could see him fighting the urge to look elsewhere, to breathe deeply, to confirm whatever his instincts had already told him, beyond any doubt. "You are soaked through," he said finally, his voice regaining some measure of its usual composure. "You should change before you catch a chill." "Yes, my lord." "Thank you." Elena moved to step past him, desperate to escape the corridor, before her trembling hands or racing pulse revealed anything further. "Elena." She froze at the sound of her name, spoken for the first time by him directly, without title or formality, carrying a weight that made her stomach twist painfully. "Yes, my lord?" He studied her for a long, silent moment, and Elena watched as something behind his eyes seemed to war between two very different impulses, one demanding immediate answers, the other exercising a restraint she did not fully understand. "Change your clothing," he said finally, his tone deliberately neutral. "We will speak again soon." The words carried an unmistakable weight of promise, or perhaps warning. Elena could not be entirely certain which. She nodded quickly and hurried away down the corridor, not daring to look back, her mind spinning with the certainty that whatever fragile secret she had protected for years now lay completely exposed before a man whose next move could determine whether she lived freely or faced a fate far worse than mere discovery. Once safely behind the locked door of her guest quarters, Elena collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the cold stone floor, her soaked clothing clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Her hands shook uncontrollably, as she replayed the encounter over and over, searching for any possible interpretation other than the obvious one. He knew, not suspected, knew, with absolute certainty, exactly what she was. And yet, he had not called for guards. He had not announced her nature before the assembled packs. He had simply released her, told her to change clothing, and promised, or perhaps threatened, that they would speak again soon. Elena forced herself to rise, stripping off her ruined dress and reaching for the small vial of tonic she kept hidden within her travel bag. Her hands trembled so badly that she spilled precious drops of the mixture across the stone floor, before managing to apply enough to her skin to feel even slightly protected again. It was a poor substitute for the thorough preparation she usually maintained, but it would have to suffice until she could properly prepare a fresh batch. She dressed quickly in dry clothing, her mind cycling endlessly through possible explanations for the king's restraint. Perhaps he intended to use his knowledge as leverage, forcing her into some form of servitude or worse, in exchange for his silence. Perhaps he planned to expose her regardless, simply choosing his moment carefully for maximum political advantage. Or perhaps, and this thought frightened her most of all, his reaction in the corridor had revealed something far more complicated than simple discovery. Something rooted in instinct rather than calculation. Something that suggested her scent had affected him as powerfully and involuntarily as his gaze had affected her. She dismissed that possibility almost immediately, unwilling to entertain hope in a situation that offered every reason for despair. Whatever his intentions, Elena understood one truth with absolute clarity now. Hiding was no longer an option. The mask she had worn for 6 years had finally slipped, and there would be no gathering it back together, no matter how much tonic she applied, or how carefully she guarded her expressions in the days ahead. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, thunder continuing to roll across the darkened sky as evening approached. Elena remained in her quarters through the dinner hour, claiming illness to avoid facing the great hall and the inevitable weight of his gaze once more. She needed time to think, to prepare, to decide how she might navigate whatever conversation awaited her, the one he had promised would come soon. She did not have to wait long. A soft knock sounded at her door just as the castle bells rang for the final hour before curfew, and Elena's entire body tensed at the sound. She rose slowly, smoothing her clothing, steadying her breath, and opened the door to find, unsurprisingly, the Alpha King standing alone in the dimly lit corridor, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "I believe we have a great deal to discuss." Elena stepped aside, her heart pounding, and allowed him to enter, understanding that whatever happened next would determine the entire course of her future. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena remained standing near the small hearth, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, while the king lingered near the entrance, seemingly choosing his words with unusual care for a man accustomed to absolute authority. "You do not need to fear me," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Whatever you expect me to do, I suspect it is not what I intend." "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, my lord," Elena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "You have discovered something dangerous about me. Most in your position would not hesitate to act on such knowledge." "Most in my position have never encountered someone quite like you," he said. "I have ruled these lands for nearly a decade, Elena. I have met countless wolves, ambitious ones, deceitful ones, desperate ones. I have learned to recognize truth beneath even the most carefully constructed disguise. Yours was more carefully constructed than most, I will admit, but it was still, in the end, a disguise." Elena said nothing, watching him carefully, waiting to understand exactly where this conversation intended to lead. "How long have you known?" she finally asked. "Since the first evening in the Great Hall," he admitted. "The moment I saw you, something in my instincts recognized what you were trying so carefully to hide. I did not act immediately, because I wished to understand why someone would go to such lengths to conceal themselves within my own kingdom." "You already know why," Elena said quietly. "Every alpha within these borders would see me as nothing more than a prize to be claimed, a rare bloodline to be fought over, stolen, or worse. I have spent 6 years making certain no one ever looked closely enough to notice." Something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like regret. "Not every alpha shares such ambitions. Forgive me if experience has taught me otherwise, my lord." He moved further into the room, though he kept a respectful distance, settling into a chair near the small table rather than approaching her directly. "Tell me what happened to your birth pack. The truth this time, not the story you offered in the meeting chamber." Elena hesitated, old wounds rising sharply to the surface, memories she had spent years trying to bury beneath layers of careful discipline and forced composure. "They came at night," she finally said, her voice tightening despite her efforts to remain steady. "Wolves from a neighboring territory, led by an alpha who had learned somehow that my birth mother carried the same rare bloodline I inherited. They did not simply want territory or resources, they wanted her, and when they discovered I existed as well, they wanted me too. My father fought to protect us. Most of our pack fought alongside him. It was not enough." The king remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace, offering no interruption, despite the visible tension gathering in his jaw. "I was young, barely old enough to understand what was happening beyond the fear and the smoke and the screaming," Elena continued. "An older cousin managed to get me away during the chaos, hiding me in the forest until the fighting ended. When we returned, there was nothing left. No pack, no home, no family, beyond the few who had managed to escape alongside us." "And your cousin?" "She did not survive the following winter. Illness, this time, genuinely. After that, I was alone, moving from settlement to settlement, never staying long enough for anyone to notice what I truly was, until Odette found me half-starved near the eastern woods and offered shelter without asking too many questions." The king's expression had darkened considerably throughout her recounting, though Elena could see the anger simmering beneath his composed exterior was not directed at her. "The alpha responsible for that attack. Do you know his name?" Elena shook her head. "I was too young to remember clearly. I have spent years trying not to think of that night at all." "I understand," he said, his voice softer now than she had heard it before. "You have carried this burden alone for a very long time. What choice did I have? None, I imagine. Which is precisely why I have no intention of adding to that burden." He rose from the chair, moving toward the window, where rain still streaked steadily down the glass. "I will not expose you, Elena. I will not claim you as some prize to be displayed before rival packs, nor will I allow anyone else within these walls to do so." Elena studied him carefully, searching for deception in his expression, and finding, to her considerable surprise, none. "Why would you extend such protection to someone you barely know? I am nothing to you, my lord. A stranger with a dangerous secret. Most rulers would see far greater advantage in exposing me than protecting me." "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but I have never been interested in advantage gained through cruelty. My own mother taught me that true strength lies not in what you can seize by force, but in what you choose to protect, despite having every opportunity to do otherwise." Something in his words struck a chord deep within Elena, loosening, if only slightly, the rigid defensive posture she had maintained since the moment he entered her quarters. "You speak as though you understand what it means to be hunted for something you did not choose." "Not the same circumstance, certainly," he admitted. "But I understand what it means to carry expectations placed upon you by nothing more than an accident of birth. My own bloodline carries certain inherited strengths that many believe define my entire worth as a ruler, as though the person beneath the inheritance matters little in comparison." Elena had not expected such vulnerability from a man whose reputation suggested nothing but unshakable authority. She found herself studying him with newfound curiosity, rather than pure suspicion, though the wariness born from years of self-preservation refused to disappear entirely. "What happens now?" she finally asked. "You know what I am. Others within this castle may begin to suspect the same, especially after this afternoon's encounter in the corridor. I will ensure no further incidents reveal what should remain private," he said firmly. "In the meantime, I would ask that you remain close to the castle for the duration of the gathering, under the guise of continued discussions regarding your settlement's security concerns. It will provide reasonable explanation for our continued conversations, without raising undue suspicion." "And after the gathering concludes?" His expression grew more serious, though something softer lingered beneath the surface. "That, Elena, depends a great deal on choices we have not yet had the opportunity to make." The ambiguity of his answer left Elena with more questions than certainty, yet something about his demeanor, the careful restraint, The deliberate distance he maintained, despite whatever instinctive pull his earlier reaction in the corridor had revealed, offered a fragile measure of reassurance she had not expected to find within these castle walls. "Thank you," she finally said, "for not doing what I feared you would. You need not thank me for simple decency, Elena. Though I understand, given your history, why such decency might feel unfamiliar." He moved toward the door, pausing briefly with his hand upon the handle. "Rest well tonight. Tomorrow's proceedings will require your continued composure, and I suspect there remains much we have yet to discuss." After he departed, Elena remained standing near the hearth for a long while, processing the strange and unexpected turn her circumstances had taken. She had entered this gathering prepared for exposure, condemnation, perhaps even violence. Instead, she found herself standing at the beginning of something far more complicated, something that stirred emotions she had spent years training herself never to feel toward anyone, least of all a man whose very title represented everything she had spent her life fearing. Yet as she finally settled onto the narrow cot and closed her eyes, sleep proved elusive, her mind replaying not the fear of discovery, but the unexpected warmth in his voice when he spoke of protecting, rather than possessing, of decency, rather than domination. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena allowed herself the dangerous luxury of cautious, fragile hope. Morning arrived with clear skies, the storm having finally passed overnight, leaving the castle grounds glistening under pale sunlight. Elena rose early, applying a carefully measured layer of fresh tonic, her hands steadier than they had been the previous day, though the weight of the king's promise from the night before lingered heavily in her thoughts. She joined the gathering as the formal proceedings resumed, taking her usual place near the back of the great hall, though today she found herself less focused on avoiding notice and more preoccupied with the strange new understanding that existed now between herself and the man seated upon the raised platform. He acknowledged her with nothing more than a brief, unreadable glance as she entered, careful, she suspected, to maintain the appearance of ordinary distance before the assembled crowd. The proceedings covered further discussions of the northern border tensions, with additional reports arriving overnight regarding increased movement among wolves loyal to the rival Alpha, Callister Vane. Elena listened with growing interest, understanding that whatever conflict brewed along those distant borders would likely shape the kingdom's priorities for the foreseeable future, and by extension, her own uncertain place within it. "Vane has requested a formal audience," one advisor announced partway through the morning session. "He claims a desire to discuss territorial boundaries peacefully, though his recent troop movements suggest otherwise." The king's expression remained carefully neutral, though Elena had grown skilled enough at reading his subtle shifts in demeanor to notice the slight tightening around his eyes. "Grant the audience," he said finally, "but increase security along the northern approach regardless. I trust actions over words when it comes to Vane's intentions." The proceedings continued through the midday hour, and Elena found herself once again summoned to a private meeting chamber shortly after the midday meal, this time under the official pretense of discussing settlement security measures, precisely as the king had suggested the previous evening. The chamber felt less tense this time, though no less charged with unspoken complexity. The king greeted her with a measure of formality, appropriate for the watchful ears of the guard stationed outside, yet the moment the door closed, his demeanor softened considerably. "I trust you slept adequately," he said, gesturing toward the same chair she had occupied during their previous meeting. "Better than expected, my lord," Elena admitted, taking the offered seat, "though I imagine much of that owes to your assurance last evening." "I meant every word of it." He remained standing near the window, much as he had before, though his posture seemed less guarded today. "I have been considering our circumstances further, and I believe there are practical matters we should address, given the reality of your situation." "Such as?" "Your safety extends beyond simply concealing your nature during this gathering," he explained. "Rival packs, particularly ambitious ones like Vane's territory, actively seek any advantage that might strengthen their position against my rule. A bloodline as rare as yours, discovered and exploited by the wrong hands, could become a significant threat, not only to your own safety, but to the stability of these lands more broadly." Elena's stomach tightened at the implication. "You believe others might already suspect what I am?" "Not yet, I think, but suspicion spreads easily within courts such as this one, especially given yesterday's encounter in the corridor. Servants talk, guards gossip. I would prefer we address the matter before rumor outpaces our ability to control it. What do you propose? He hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I propose you remain under my direct protection for the time being, officially, as an advisor, assisting with matters concerning Eastern settlement security, a plausible enough arrangement, given recent northern tensions. It would allow me to ensure your safety, without drawing undue attention to the true nature of the arrangement. Elena studied him carefully, searching for any hidden motive beneath the practical explanation. And Odette, my settlement? Odette need not know the full truth, if you prefer to keep it that way. I can arrange the official explanation through proper channels, ensuring your absence causes no suspicion or hardship for your settlement. The proposal carried obvious risks, tying her fate more closely to his than she had ever intended to allow with anyone, let alone a ruler whose authority could crush her the moment his intentions shifted. Yet the alternative, returning to the constant vigilance and isolation she had maintained for 6 long years, held its own exhausting weight. I would need time to consider such an arrangement, she said finally. Of course, I do not expect an immediate answer. He moved from the window, settling into the chair across from her, rather than maintaining his usual distance. Though I will admit, Elena, my reasons for this proposal extend beyond simple political convenience. What do you mean? He studied her for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering behind his usually composed expression. Since the moment I recognized what you truly were, I have found myself unable to stop thinking of you, not merely as a secret requiring careful management, but as someone whose strength in surviving such circumstances, I find myself genuinely admiring. Elena's breath caught at the unexpected honesty in his words. My lord, I do not think it wise to— I am not suggesting anything inappropriate, he interrupted gently. I simply believe honesty between us serves us both better than pretense, given everything already at stake. Honesty is a luxury I have rarely been able to afford, Elena admitted. Trust, even less so. Then perhaps we might begin building both, slowly, without expectation, beyond simple mutual respect. The sincerity in his voice, coupled with the vulnerability she had glimpsed only briefly beneath his usual composed authority, stirred something within Elena she had not allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. Still, caution remained deeply ingrained within her, a survival instinct too valuable to abandon, based on a handful of unexpectedly gentle conversations. I will consider your proposal, she said finally, but I ask for time, and for continued discretion, regardless of my final decision. You have both, for as long as you require them. Their conversation shifted afterward to more practical matters, discussions of how her continued presence within the castle might be explained to curious onlookers, and what precautions she might take to further strengthen her disguise until a final decision could be reached. The king proved surprisingly knowledgeable regarding herbal remedies capable of masking scent, offering suggestions Elena had never considered despite her years of careful experimentation. How does someone in your position know so much about concealment methods? She finally asked, genuinely curious. A ruler benefits from understanding every possible advantage his enemies might employ against him, he explained. Knowledge of concealment, deception, and disguise serves as valuable defense against those who might seek to exploit such methods against my own interests. A practical education, then, rather than personal necessity. Precisely. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the answer than he had shared, though Elena chose not to press the matter further, understanding that trust, however slowly it might build between them, required patience from both sides. As their meeting concluded, and Elena prepared to return to the Great Hall for the afternoon's remaining proceedings, the king offered one final observation that lingered in her thoughts throughout the remainder of the day. Whatever you decide, Elena, know that my offer of protection extends regardless of whether you choose to accept the broader arrangement I have proposed. You will not leave this gathering more vulnerable than when you arrived. That much, I promise you absolutely. The certainty in his voice, free of any calculated ambition or hidden agenda she could detect, settled something deep within Elena that had remained tightly wound since the night her birth pack had been destroyed so many years before. For the first time since that devastating loss, she found herself genuinely considering the possibility that safety might not require complete isolation, that trust, however cautiously extended, might not inevitably lead to betrayal and loss. It was a dangerous thought, one she was not yet prepared to fully embrace, But as she made her way back through the castle corridors, toward the great hall, Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine a future where hiding was no longer the only path toward survival. 3 days passed before Elena reached her decision. 3 days filled with careful observation, cautious conversation, and the gradual, almost imperceptible dismantling of walls she had spent years constructing around herself. The king, whose name she now permitted herself to think as Cain, rather than the distant title she had clung to for protection, proved consistent in his patience, never pressing for answers before she was ready to offer them. During those 3 days, the northern tensions continued escalating. Reports arrived daily, detailing further troop movements from Callister Vane's territory, and the promised audience between Cain and the rival Alpha had been scheduled for the following week, a meeting many advisors feared might prove more provocation than genuine negotiation. Elena found herself increasingly drawn into these discussions, her insight into the eastern settlements offering genuine value to the broader security conversations occurring throughout the castle. She discovered, somewhat to her surprise, a natural aptitude for strategic thinking, honed unknowingly through years of careful survival and constant vigilance against discovery. "You possess a sharper mind for these matters than most of my formally appointed advisors," Cain observed one evening, as they reviewed reports together in his private study, a space Elena had been granted increasing access to over the preceding days. "Years of hiding taught you to think several steps ahead of potential threats. That skill translates remarkably well to matters of kingdom security." "Necessity breeds competence," Elena replied, though she could not entirely suppress the small flush of pride his words stirred within her. "I would have preferred an education that did not require constant fear as its foundation." Understandable. Though I suspect that same fear-forged competence may prove valuable in the days ahead, particularly if Vane's intentions prove as hostile as I suspect. Their evenings together had settled into a comfortable rhythm, discussions of settlement security gradually giving way to more personal conversations as trust between them deepened. Elena learned of Cain's own complicated relationship with his inherited authority, the weight of expectations placed upon him since childhood, the loneliness that came with a position few could truly understand or relate to as equals. In turn, she found herself sharing more of her own history than she had ever confided to anyone beyond Odette, memories of her birth pack, fragments of happier times before the attack that had shattered everything she once knew, hopes she had long suppressed beneath the constant demands of survival. "Do you ever wish for a life beyond simple survival?" Cain asked one evening, as they sat together near the study's modest hearth, the fire casting warm light across features that had grown increasingly familiar to her over the preceding days. "I have not allowed myself such wishes in a long time," Elena admitted. "Survival requires focus. Dreams of anything beyond that focus felt like dangerous distractions. And now?" She considered the question carefully, aware of the weight it carried beyond its simple phrasing. "Now I find myself uncertain what such dreams might even look like, having denied myself the privilege of imagining them for so long. Perhaps that uncertainty need not remain permanent." Elena studied him in the firelight, searching for any hint of manipulation or hidden agenda behind his gentle words, and finding, as she had increasingly come to expect, nothing but genuine sincerity. "You continue to surprise me, Cain. I expected authority, perhaps arrogance befitting your title. I did not expect such patience, nor such genuine consideration for someone in my precarious position." "Perhaps because I recognize something of myself within your caution," he replied. "We have both spent considerable energy protecting ourselves from a world that sees us primarily as our bloodlines dictate, rather than who we truly are beneath such inheritance." That evening, as their conversation deepened further, Elena finally offered the answer she had spent 3 days carefully considering. "I accept your proposal," she said quietly. "I will remain under your protection, serving as an advisor for the eastern settlements, for as long as circumstances require such an arrangement." Something shifted in Cain's expression, relief mingling with something warmer, something Elena had begun to recognize as genuine affection, rather than mere political calculation. "I am glad," he said simply. "Though I want you to understand, Elena, that this arrangement carries no obligation beyond what you freely choose to offer. Whatever develops between us, if anything develops at all, must remain entirely your decision." "I appreciate that assurance," Elena replied. though I confess, the boundaries of my own feelings regarding our arrangement have grown considerably less clear over these past few days. Kane's expression softened further at her admission, though he made no move to close the careful distance that remained between them, respecting, as he had consistently demonstrated, the delicate balance of trust they had only begun to establish. Then perhaps we allow those feelings to develop naturally, without forcing conclusions neither of us feels prepared to reach. Their arrangement was formally announced the following morning, framed precisely as Kane had suggested. Elena presented as a newly appointed advisor assisting with matters of Eastern settlement security, given the ongoing tensions along the northern border. Odette, informed through proper diplomatic channels rather than direct confrontation, expressed surprise but ultimately relief that Elena's unusual circumstances had somehow found favorable resolution within the castle's political structure. The gathered representatives accepted the explanation with minimal scrutiny, distracted as they were by the mounting concerns regarding Vane's escalating provocations. Elena settled into her new role with cautious optimism, contributing genuinely valuable insight to ongoing security discussions, while gradually allowing herself to imagine, for the first time in years, a future built on something other than perpetual concealment. Yet even as trust deepened between herself and Kane, and her role within the castle solidified into something resembling genuine purpose, a persistent unease continued lingering at the edges of Elena's newfound stability. Whispers regarding her unusual scent, first noticed during that fateful rainstorm encounter, had not entirely disappeared, despite Kane's careful management of the situation. Some among the castle's guards and servants had begun speculating quietly among themselves, wondering at the peculiar circumstances surrounding her sudden elevation to advisor status. Elena did her best to ignore such whispers, focusing instead on the genuine value she provided through her strategic insights, and the slowly blossoming connection developing between herself and Kane. But she understood, with the same instinctive caution that had preserved her survival for 6 long years, that secrets rarely remained buried forever, particularly within a castle filled with ambitious advisors, curious servants, and rival factions eager for any advantage against the crown. The peace she had found, however genuine and welcome, felt fragile, built upon a foundation that could crumble the moment the wrong ears learned the truth she had spent so long protecting. And as reports from the northern border continued growing increasingly concerning, Elena could not shake the growing certainty that whatever conflict lay ahead would test not only Kane's rule, but the delicate trust and cautious hope they had only just begun building together. Word arrived early one morning that Callister Vane had accepted the invitation for formal audience, arriving with a modest escort 3 days ahead of the agreed schedule, a deliberate move Kane immediately recognized as an attempt to catch the castle unprepared. Elena watched from a window overlooking the main courtyard as Vane's procession entered through the gates, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold eyes and a confident swagger that immediately set her instincts on edge. "He arrives early to test our readiness," Kane explained later that morning, as they reviewed the situation together in his private study, a common tactic among ambitious rivals, seeking any perceived weakness in preparation or protocol. "What does he actually want?" Elena asked. "Beyond simple provocation? Territory, most likely, disguised beneath claims of contested boundaries. Vane has long believed the northern regions rightfully belong under his authority, despite generations of established agreements stating otherwise." The formal audience took place the following afternoon within the Great Hall, and Elena, given her advisory role, found herself permitted to observe from a position near the platform, close enough to witness every subtle exchange between the two rival leaders. Vane presented his case with practiced eloquence, framing his territorial ambitions as reasonable requests for fair reconsideration of outdated boundaries, though the underlying threat beneath his polished words remained unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. The northern settlements have long suffered under boundaries drawn generations ago, before circumstances shifted considerably, Vane argued, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. "I ask only for fair reconsideration, in the interest of preventing unnecessary conflict between our territories." "Fair reconsideration," Kane replied evenly, "or convenient justification for expansion, you have already begun pursuing through increased military presence along contested regions." Vane's expression flickered, briefly, with something sharper before settling back into practiced diplomacy. "Precautionary measures only, given the uncertainty surrounding these very discussions." The exchange continued for nearly an hour, both leaders maintaining careful diplomatic composure, despite the obvious tension simmering beneath their measured words. Elena observed closely, noting details of Vane's posture, his expressions. The subtle signals that suggested his true intentions extended considerably beyond simple diplomatic negotiation. As the audience concluded without any genuine resolution, Vane's gaze swept briefly across the assembled advisors, before settling, unexpectedly, on Elena herself. His eyes lingered a moment longer than casual observation warranted, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, and Elena's stomach dropped as she recognized the same instinctive recognition she had witnessed in Kane weeks before. Vane knew, or at least suspected, something unusual about her. She said nothing during the immediate aftermath of the audience, waiting until she and Kane were alone within the privacy of his study, before voicing her concern. Vane noticed something during the audience, she said carefully. The way he looked at me, the way his expression shifted, similar to how you reacted that first evening in the courtyard. Kane's expression darkened considerably. Are you certain? Not entirely, but the similarity was unsettling enough that I felt compelled to mention it. This complicates matters considerably, Kane said, pacing thoughtfully near the hearth. If Vane suspects your true nature, he may attempt to exploit that knowledge as leverage against my rule, either through direct threat or through attempts to claim you for himself, believing your bloodline might strengthen his own territorial ambitions. What can we do? For now, limit your visible presence during Vane's remaining time within the castle. I will increase security around your quarters and ensure guards remain alert to any suspicious activity involving his escort. Elena spent the following days largely confined to the castle's inner wings, venturing into public areas only when necessary, always accompanied by trusted guards, personally selected by Kane. The precaution felt suffocating after the relative freedom she had begun enjoying since accepting her advisory role, yet she understood the necessity, given the mounting danger Vane's suspicion represented. Despite these precautions, tension continued building throughout the castle, as Vane's escort remained longer than initially anticipated, citing various minor pretexts for delayed departure. Kane's advisors grew increasingly convinced that Vane sought opportunity for further reconnaissance, perhaps searching for confirmation regarding Elena's true nature, or seeking other vulnerabilities within the castle's defenses. The confirmation of Vane's suspicions arrived far sooner than anyone anticipated. Late one evening, as Elena prepared to retire following a lengthy strategy session with Kane and his senior advisors, a guard burst into the study, his expression grave with urgent concern. "My lord," he said breathlessly, "one of Vane's escort was discovered attempting to bribe a kitchen servant for information regarding the identity and background of the newly appointed advisor." Kane's expression turned to stone, cold fury simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "Where is this escort member now?" "Detained, my lord, though Vane's remaining party grows increasingly agitated at the delay this has caused." "Bring Vane to me immediately," Kane commanded. "I will address this breach of diplomatic conduct directly." Elena's pulse raced as she watched Kane's controlled fury unfold, understanding with sickening clarity that whatever fragile secret she had protected now stood at genuine risk of complete exposure, potentially triggering consequences far beyond her own personal safety. Vane arrived within the study shortly after, his expression carefully composed, despite the obvious tension gathering within the room. "You summoned me, my lord. One of your escort attempted to bribe my staff for information regarding my advisor," Kane stated flatly. "I would like an explanation." Vane's expression remained infuriatingly calm. "Simple curiosity, my lord. Your sudden appointment of an advisor whose background remains largely undisclosed raises natural questions among those concerned with the security of these negotiations. Curiosity does not justify bribery within the walls of my own castle," Kane replied, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, despite its measured calm. "I would advise your escort exercise considerably more restraint should you wish these negotiations to continue in good faith." "Of course, my lord. I meant no offense." Vane's gaze flickered briefly toward Elena, who stood near the hearth, doing her best to maintain outward composure, despite the fear tightening within her chest. "Though I confess, the advisor herself carries an unusual presence that has drawn considerable attention among my own party. Perhaps she might satisfy our curiosity directly, rather than requiring my staff to seek answers through less diplomatic means." The implicit threat within his words settled heavily across the room, and Elena felt Kane's protective attention shift immediately toward her, his posture subtly shifting into something more defensive, despite his outwardly calm demeanor. "My advisor's background is not relevant to these negotiations," Kane stated firmly. "I would suggest you focus your attention on matters of actual diplomatic substance, rather than idle curiosity regarding my personal staff." Vane's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he offered a shallow bow of acknowledgement. "Of course, my lord. I meant no disrespect." He turned to leave, though his gaze lingered on Elena for one final, unsettling moment before he departed the study entirely. Once the door closed behind him, Elena finally allowed the tension she had carefully suppressed to surface. "He knows something, Kane, or at the very least, suspects strongly enough to pursue the matter further." "I fear you may be correct," Kane admitted, his expression grave. "Which means we must act carefully in the days ahead, ensuring Vane finds no further opportunity to confirm whatever suspicions he currently harbors." "And if he does confirm them regardless?" Kane's expression hardened with unmistakable resolve. "Then he will discover precisely how far I am willing to go to protect what has become genuinely important to me, Elena, both as a matter of kingdom security and as a matter of personal conviction." The weight of his words, and the fierce protectiveness behind them, offered Elena a measure of comfort, even amid the mounting danger surrounding her. Yet as she retired to her quarters that evening, sleep proved elusive once more, her mind consumed by the unsettling certainty that whatever conflict lay ahead would test not only Kane's resolve, but the fragile safety she had only just begun to genuinely believe in. Vane's escort departed the castle 2 days later, though the uneasy tension his visit had introduced lingered long after his procession vanished beyond the outer gates. Kane increased security measures throughout the castle grounds, particularly around Elena's quarters and the study where much of their strategic planning took place. Yet the sense of impending threat refused to fully dissipate. Reports arriving from the northern border in the following weeks confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. Vane's territorial ambitions had not been abandoned following the tense audience, but rather accelerated, with increased troop movements observed along multiple points of contested boundary. More concerning still, several informants within Vane's own territory reported hearing rumors circulating among his inner circle regarding a rare bloodline discovered within the king's own court, one Vane apparently believed might prove instrumental in strengthening whatever ambitious plans he continued pursuing. "He intends to use knowledge of your existence as justification for aggressive action," Kane explained grimly, reviewing the latest intelligence reports within his study one evening. "Either through direct attempt to seize you for his own purposes, or through public accusation, designed to destabilize my rule by suggesting I have concealed a valuable bloodline for personal advantage, rather than proper political transparency." "Either outcome seems disastrous," Elena said, genuine fear coloring her voice for the first time in weeks. "Which is precisely why we must act, before Vane finds opportunity to act first," Kane replied, his expression set with grim determination. Their strategic discussions over the following days grew increasingly focused on contingency planning, preparing for various scenarios that might unfold should Vane's suspicions translate into direct action. Elena found herself contributing meaningfully to these discussions, her intimate understanding of concealment and evasion tactics, honed through years of personal necessity, proving genuinely valuable in anticipating potential threats. Yet despite these preparations, nothing could have fully prepared them for the sudden, brazen attack that occurred less than 2 weeks later. It began quietly, in the deepest hours of the night, when Elena awoke suddenly to the sound of hushed voices and careful footsteps just beyond her quarters. Her instincts, sharpened through years of constant vigilance, recognized immediately that something was deeply wrong. She rose silently from her bed, reaching for the small dagger Kane had insisted she keep hidden beneath her pillow following Vane's visit, and crept carefully toward the door. Before she could reach it, the door burst open violently, revealing 2 unfamiliar figures, dressed in dark clothing, designed for stealth rather than formal escort. Elena reacted instantly, years of careful training and desperate survival instinct taking over as she moved to defend herself against the sudden intrusion. The struggle that followed was brief but fierce, Elena managing to injure one intruder badly enough to slow his advance, while she called out sharply for the castle guards stationed nearby. Her cry brought immediate response, guards flooding into the corridor within moments, quickly subduing both intruders before they could complete whatever mission had brought them into the castle's supposedly secure inner wings. Kane arrived moments later, his expression a mixture of fury and profound relief upon finding Elena shaken but entirely unharmed. "Are you injured?" he demanded, checking her over with obvious concern despite the guards already securing the captured intruders. "No, only startled," Elena replied, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. "They came for me specifically, Kane. I am certain of it." Interrogation of the captured intruders, conducted immediately following the incident, confirmed everyone's worst suspicions. Both men admitted, under Kane's stern and unwavering questioning, that they had been sent by Callister Vane himself, tasked with confirming Elena's true identity, and, should confirmation prove successful, capturing her for transport back to Vane's own territory. "He intended to use you as leverage," Kane explained afterward, fury simmering visibly beneath his composed exterior. "Either forcing my hand through threat of your capture, or claiming your bloodline for his own ambitious purposes, strengthening his position against my rule." "What happens now?" Elena asked, still processing the terrifying reality of how close she had come to capture. "Now, Vane has revealed his hand far sooner and more brazenly than even I anticipated," Kane replied, his expression hardening with grim resolve. "An attack within the walls of my own castle, against my own advisor, cannot go unanswered. This constitutes a direct act of aggression, one that justifies immediate and decisive response." The following days moved quickly, Kane rallying his loyal forces and formally declaring Vane's actions a clear violation of established peace agreements between their territories. Messengers were dispatched throughout the kingdom, rallying support from neighboring settlements and allied pacts, who recognized the danger Vane's ambitious aggression posed to the broader stability of the region. Elena, despite the obvious danger she now represented as the direct target of Vane's ambitions, refused to remain passively hidden while conflict brewed around her. "I will not simply wait helplessly while others fight to protect me," she told Kane firmly, during one of their increasingly frequent strategic discussions. "I have spent 6 years hiding from exactly this kind of danger. I refuse to spend whatever conflict follows doing the same." "Your safety remains my absolute priority, Elena," Kane replied, though his expression suggested he understood, and perhaps even respected her determination. "And my safety depends significantly on Vane's ambitions being decisively defeated," Elena countered. "I have knowledge of concealment, evasion, and survival that few among your forces possess. Allow me to contribute meaningfully to whatever strategy you develop, rather than simply hiding, while others determine my fate." Kane studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks against the genuine value her insight might provide. "Very well," he finally conceded, "but you will remain under close protection throughout, regardless of whatever role you play in our broader strategy." Their combined efforts over the following days focused on strengthening the castle's defenses, while simultaneously preparing a decisive response to Vane's escalating aggression. Elena's intimate understanding of concealment tactics proved invaluable in anticipating potential infiltration attempts, while her insight into fear-driven decision-making, born from years of studying threats against her own survival, helped Kane's advisors better predict Vane's likely strategic choices. As preparations continued, the bond between Elena and Kane deepened considerably, forged through shared danger and mutual reliance, in ways that transcended the cautious, careful trust they had built during the earlier weeks of the gathering. Elena found herself relying on Kane not merely as a protector, but as a genuine partner in navigating the mounting crisis, while Kane, in turn, discovered increasing respect and admiration for Elena's resilience and strategic capability beyond simple physical concealment. "You continue to surprise me," Kane admitted one evening, as they reviewed final preparations before what everyone anticipated would become open conflict with Vane's forces. "I expected someone skilled in hiding. I did not expect someone equally skilled in fighting for what she believes worth protecting." "Perhaps," Elena replied. "Hiding and fighting require more similar skills than either of us initially realized." Their growing partnership, forged through shared adversity and mutual respect, offered Elena something she had not believed possible during her years of isolated survival: genuine connection built not upon desperate necessity, but upon authentic trust and shared purpose. Yet as reports confirmed Vane's forces were indeed mobilizing for direct confrontation, both understood that whatever conflict lay immediately ahead would test not only their carefully prepared strategies, but the depth of trust and connection they had built together in these tumultuous weeks. Word arrived on a cold gray morning that Vane's forces had crossed the contested northern boundary, advancing steadily toward one of the smaller border settlements loyal to Kane's rule. The settlement, poorly defended and vulnerable to swift assault, represented precisely the kind of target Vane would choose to demonstrate his growing strength, while testing Kane's willingness to respond decisively. "We cannot allow that settlement to fall," Kane declared during the emergency council convened immediately upon receiving the news. "Doing so would signal weakness to every ambitious rival, watching how we respond to this aggression." The council quickly organized a response force, combining Kane's most experienced fighters with reinforcements from allied settlements, who had answered his earlier call for support. Elena, despite Kane's initial reluctance, insisted on accompanying the response force, arguing convincingly that her insight into Vane's likely tactics could prove decisive in protecting the threatened settlement. "I cannot simply remain behind castle walls while others risk everything to protect what Vane seeks to destroy," she told Kane firmly, as preparations for departure continued around them. "My understanding of concealment and evasion could mean the difference between successfully defending that settlement or losing it entirely." Kane's expression conveyed obvious concern, though ultimately he relented, understanding the genuine value her insight offered, despite the personal risk it represented. "You will remain close to me throughout," he insisted. "I cannot protect you effectively if you insist on placing yourself in unnecessary danger." "Agreed," Elena replied, though both understood that whatever conflict lay ahead would inevitably carry risks neither could fully control or anticipate. The journey toward the threatened settlement took the better part of 2 days, Kane's forces moving swiftly, but carefully, mindful of potential ambush along the contested border regions. Elena rode alongside Kane throughout, her mind constantly analyzing potential strategic considerations, drawing upon years of instinctive threat assessment honed through personal necessity rather than formal military training. They arrived at the settlement just as Vane's forces began their initial assault, smoke already rising from several structures near the settlement's outer perimeter. Kane's forces moved immediately to engage, and Elena, true to her promise, remained close beside Kane throughout the ensuing conflict, offering tactical insight whenever opportunity allowed, while trusting Kane's experienced fighters to handle the direct confrontation itself. The battle raged fiercely through the following hours, Kane's forces gradually gaining advantage through superior coordination and the element of reinforcement Vane's scouts had apparently failed to anticipate. Elena watched as Kane fought with fierce determination, his authority as ruler matched by genuine skill and courage in direct confrontation, protecting not only the threatened settlement, but, she understood implicitly, everything they had built together during these tumultuous weeks. As the conflict began turning decisively in Kane's favor, Vane himself emerged from the chaos, clearly recognizing that his ambitious assault had failed to achieve the swift victory he had anticipated. His eyes found Elena immediately across the battlefield, and something desperate and calculating flickered across his expression as he recognized, perhaps, his final opportunity to salvage some advantage from the failing assault. He moved toward her with sudden, alarming speed, clearly intending to seize the opportunity for capture, even as his broader forces began retreating from Kane's superior numbers. Elena reacted instantly, drawing upon every survival instinct she had cultivated throughout years of evading exactly this kind of threat, moving swiftly to avoid his initial approach, while calling out sharply for assistance. Kane arrived within moments, placing himself directly between Elena and Vane's advancing threat, his expression carrying an intensity Elena had never before witnessed, protective fury mixed with unwavering determination. "You will not touch her," Kane stated, his voice carrying absolute authority, despite the chaos surrounding them. Vane's expression twisted with desperate frustration. "She belongs to whoever proves strongest enough to claim her, Kane. Bloodlines such as hers exist beyond simple sentiment or misguided protection." "She belongs to no one but herself," Kane replied fiercely, "and I will die before allowing you or anyone else to treat her as mere property to be claimed." The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisive, Kane's skill and determination ultimately proving superior to Vane's desperate final gambit. Vane, recognizing the hopelessness of his position as his remaining forces continued retreating around him, finally withdrew, his ambitious assault having failed catastrophically against the combined resistance of Kane's forces and allied reinforcements. As the battle concluded and the immediate threat subsided, Kane turned immediately toward Elena, his expression shifting from fierce protective determination to genuine relief and concern. "Are you injured?" he asked urgently, checking her over carefully, despite the chaos still settling around them. "No, thanks to you," Elena replied, her voice carrying genuine gratitude alongside the lingering adrenaline of the terrifying confrontation. "You risked everything to protect me, Kane. I would risk considerably more than that," he replied, his voice softening despite the exhaustion evident in his expression. "Elena, these past weeks have shown me something I did not fully understand before meeting you. That true strength lies not merely in ruling effectively, but in protecting what genuinely matters, regardless of personal risk or political consequence." The settlement, though damaged by the brief but intense conflict, had ultimately been saved from Vane's ambitious assault, and news of the decisive victory spread quickly throughout the kingdom, strengthening Kane's position considerably, while simultaneously weakening whatever remaining support Vane's ambitious territorial claims might have previously enjoyed among neighboring settlements. As they began the journey back toward the castle, the immediate danger finally behind them, Elena found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired since that first fateful gathering weeks before. She had arrived expecting exposure, condemnation, perhaps even violence should her true nature ever be discovered. Instead, she had found genuine protection, unexpected partnership, and something she had not believed herself capable of experiencing again, after the devastating loss of her birth pack so many years before. Authentic trust and connection, built upon mutual respect, rather than desperate necessity. "What happens now?" she asked Kane quietly, as they rode together through the gradually clearing countryside, the immediate crisis finally behind them. Kane considered the question carefully before responding, his expression thoughtful despite the exhaustion still evident from the recent conflict. "Now, Elena, I believe it is time we discussed openly what has been developing between us these past weeks, without the constant threat of Vane's ambitious schemes overshadowing every conversation." Elena's heart quickened at his words, understanding implicitly that whatever conversation awaited them upon their return to the castle would likely determine not merely her continued safety, but the entire course of whatever future might exist between herself and the Alpha King who had, against every expectation she had, carried into that fateful gathering, chosen genuine protection and partnership over exploitation and betrayal. The castle welcomed them home with quiet celebration, word of the decisive victory against Vane's forces having traveled ahead of their return, settlements throughout the kingdom expressing relief that the ambitious threat to their stability had been so thoroughly repelled. Yet amid the celebration, Elena found herself increasingly focused on the conversation Kane had promised during their journey back, understanding that whatever followed would shape the remainder of her future in ways she had not previously allowed herself to imagine. That evening, Kane requested her presence within his private study, the same space where so much of their careful trust had been built during the preceding weeks. Elena arrived to find him standing near the tall windows overlooking the castle grounds, moonlight casting soft silver light across features that had become deeply familiar to her over these tumultuous weeks. "You wish to speak with me," Elena said, closing the door quietly behind her. "I did." Kane turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him throughout their acquaintance. "Elena, since the moment I first recognized what you truly were, hiding beneath careful disguise in my own great hall, I have found myself increasingly unable to view you as merely a secret requiring protection, or an advisor providing valuable strategic insight." Elena's breath caught at the sincerity evident in his voice. "What are you saying, Kane?" "I am saying that these past weeks have shown me something I did not fully understand before your arrival within my kingdom, that genuine partnership, built upon mutual respect and authentic trust rather than obligation or political convenience, represents something far more valuable than any advantage I might have gained through simple exploitation of your rare bloodline." He moved closer, though he maintained careful distance, respecting even now the boundaries they had established throughout their growing connection. I find myself, Elena, genuinely and completely drawn to you, not merely for what your bloodline represents, but for who you are beneath it, resilient, intelligent, courageous, despite circumstances that would have broken most others entirely. Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly at his heartfelt admission, 6 years of carefully guarded emotion finally beginning to surface after everything they had endured together. I have spent so long believing that trust inevitably leads to betrayal, that vulnerability represents nothing but dangerous weakness, she admitted quietly. You have shown me, through your consistent patience and genuine protection, that such belief need not remain permanent. Then perhaps, Kane said softly, closing the remaining distance between them, we might consider building something genuine together, without the constant shadow of concealment and fear that has defined so much of both our lives until now. I would like that, Elena replied, her voice carrying quiet certainty despite the vulnerability inherent in such admission. Though I confess, the idea of no longer hiding, of allowing others to see me fully without fear of exploitation or capture, remains both exhilarating and deeply frightening. You need not face that transition alone, Kane assured her. Whatever challenges arise from your true nature becoming known throughout the kingdom, I will stand beside you throughout, ensuring your safety and your standing remain protected, regardless of whatever complications might follow. In the days that followed, Kane made the decision to formally acknowledge Elena's true nature before his assembled court, understanding that continued concealment, however carefully managed, remained ultimately unsustainable, given the events that had already transpired with Vane's forces. He called for a formal gathering, reminiscent of the one that had first brought Elena into his kingdom weeks before, though this time the purpose carried entirely different weight and significance. Standing before the assembled representatives of Pax throughout his kingdom, Kane spoke with unwavering confidence and conviction. Weeks ago, this gathering welcomed among its numbers a woman whose true nature required careful concealment, given the exploitation and danger such bloodlines have historically faced throughout our kingdom's complicated history. I stand before you today to acknowledge that woman, Elena Hart, not as a secret to be hidden or a prize to be claimed, but as someone whose courage, resilience, and genuine partnership has proven invaluable to the continued stability and security of these lands. Murmurs spread through the assembled crowd, though Kane continued before uncertainty could fully take hold. I also stand before you to declare, openly and without reservation, that Elena Hart represents not merely a valuable advisor to this kingdom's security, but someone I have come to genuinely and completely care for, someone I intend to formally recognize as my chosen partner, should she continue to accept such recognition. Elena, standing beside him before the assembled crowd, felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, yet found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid of such attention. 6 years of careful concealment, of constant vigilance against discovery, had finally given way to genuine acceptance, not merely tolerated by the powerful ruler beside her, but genuinely celebrated and protected. I accept, she said clearly, her voice carrying steady conviction despite the momentous nature of the declaration. Not merely the recognition you offer, Kane, but the partnership, the trust, and the genuine future we have begun building together these past weeks. The assembled crowd, initially uncertain how to respond to such unprecedented declaration, gradually shifted toward genuine celebration, understanding implicitly the significance of witnessing their king choose partnership, built upon authentic respect rather than mere political calculation or exploitation of rare and valuable bloodlines. In the weeks that followed, Elena settled fully into her new role, no longer requiring the careful herbal concealment that had defined so much of her previous existence. She found genuine purpose in continuing to serve as an advisor throughout the kingdom, her unique insight into concealment, evasion, and strategic thinking proving invaluable in strengthening the kingdom's defenses against future threats, while her growing partnership with Kane offered something she had never believed herself capable of experiencing again, after the devastating loss of her birth pack so many years before. Vane's ambitious territorial claims, thoroughly discredited following his failed assault and the subsequent revelation of his desperate attempt to capture Elena for his own purposes, gradually lost support among neighboring settlements, eventually forcing him into a considerably weakened position that posed little further threat to the stability Kane had worked so diligently to maintain throughout his kingdom. Elena often found herself reflecting, during quiet evening moments, spent alongside Cain within the castle's peaceful courtyards, on the remarkable transformation her circumstances had undergone since that fateful gathering weeks before. She had arrived expecting nothing but continued concealment and fear, prepared to spend whatever remained of her existence hiding from a world that saw her rare bloodline as nothing more than a prize to be claimed through force or deception. Instead, she had found genuine partnership, unwavering protection, and the profound realization that trust, however cautiously extended, need not inevitably lead toward betrayal and loss. The Alpha King, who had recognized her true nature from their very first encounter, had chosen, throughout every subsequent challenge and danger they faced together, genuine respect and protection over exploitation and control. Ajayla stood beside Cain one final evening, watching the sun set gently over the kingdom they now protected together. She allowed herself, without hesitation or fear, to fully embrace the future stretching before them, no longer defined by hiding or survival alone, but by genuine partnership, mutual respect, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she had finally found not merely safety, but a place where she truly belonged.